Two Indian tankers, fired on by Iranian gunboats. One day after Iran's own foreign minister promised the exact opposite. That actually happened. And what India did next broke a foreign policy tradition that's held for decades. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what occurred and why India's response is genuinely more significant than most people realize. Stick with me through this one, because by the end, I'm going to show you a diplomatic balancing act so delicate it involves the same government sheltering an Iranian warship crew on humanitarian grounds one month, then summoning Iran's ambassador for one of the sharpest protests of the entire war the next. Ryan here, Max Afterburner, former F-15E combat pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird, flying airliners these days. This story involves India, a country that almost never gets covered on channels like this one, and I think that's exactly why it deserves careful attention today. Because the way mid-sized powers actually navigate a war like this one tells you just as much about how conflicts actually unfold as the headline battles between the main combatants do. Let's start with the attack itself, because the timing here is what makes this story genuinely infuriating. And I think laying it out chronologically actually makes the betrayal land harder than any summary could. According to the Middle East Forum, two Indian-flagged vessels came under fire from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps gunboats on April 18th near Larak Island, while attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz, fired on by gunboats, while simply trying to move through international waters that international law generally treats as a rite of passage for any nation's shipping. Both ships were forced to reverse course entirely, abandoning their transit and turning back the way they came. A genuinely humiliating and dangerous outcome for any commercial vessel and its crew. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely galling. Just one day earlier, Iran's own foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, had announced that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open for navigation. His exact words, quote, "In line with the ceasefire, the passage for all commercial vessels is declared completely open for the remaining period of the ceasefire." Completely open. Those were his words. 24 hours before Indian ships got shot at, coming directly from the man responsible for Iran's official foreign policy positions. Naval Today's reporting added more specific detail about exactly where this happened. The ships came under fire while transiting waters between Sushma Island and Larak Island, a stretch of the strait Iran effectively treats as its own backyard, close enough to Iranian territory that IRGC patrol boats operate there routinely. That same Naval Today report noted something worth mentioning for accuracy's sake. No casualties or confirmed damage were reported from the incident itself, which is genuinely fortunate, given how easily an encounter like this could have ended far worse for the crews involved. Iran International, in its own coverage, reported that audio recordings indicated IRGC gunboats fired during the encounter as the ships were redirected westward, away from their intended route. One of the vessels involved was a very large crude carrier, hauling roughly 2 million barrels of Iraqi oil at the time. 2 million barrels. On a ship that got turned around at gunpoint, its entire voyage disrupted by a threat that had been explicitly promised not to happen just a day earlier. I want to be clear about something here too, because it matters for how you weigh this story. This wasn't the first time Indian shipping had been caught up in this broader crisis either. Reports throughout the earlier months of this war documented Indian-flagged vessels navigating the strait under close watch, with India's government running a 24-hour control room specifically to track and support its seafarers caught in this exact conflict zone. So April 18th wasn't some isolated, out-of-nowhere shock. It was the latest and most direct escalation in a pattern of risk Indian shipping had already been managing for weeks. Now here's where India's response actually starts, and I want to walk you through it step by step, because this is where things get genuinely interesting, and I think most coverage of this story skips right past the details that actually make it significant. According to Marine Insight's direct reporting, India summoned Iran's ambassador in New Delhi in what that outlet described as one of the sharpest diplomatic protests of the entire crisis. Summoned the ambassador. That's not a routine diplomatic gesture. That's a formal pointed rebuke, the kind of move India rarely makes against countries it maintains careful, deliberately warm relations with, especially a country India has spent decades cultivating economic and strategic ties with. Naval Today's coverage confirmed the same event through an official statement. Iran's ambassador was called in for urgent consultations with India's foreign secretary, specifically because of what New Delhi described as, quote, deep concern over the firing on civilian vessels. Deep concern. In diplomatic language, that phrase carries real weight. It's not a shrug. It's a formal signal that a relationship has been genuinely tested, the kind of language that gets chosen very deliberately by career diplomats who understand exactly how much weight each specific word carries in this context. The Foreign Secretary reportedly underscored, in that same meeting, how critically important India considers the safety of merchant shipping and seafarers, particularly, in the ministry's own words, in high-risk maritime zones such as the Persian Gulf, a statement that pointedly places responsibility on Iran for the danger its own actions had just created. I think it's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't India's first public statement about attacks on shipping in this exact war. Back in March, according to a statement from India's External Affairs Ministry, the country had already condemned a separate attack on a Thai vessel bound for an Indian port, saying explicitly that targeting commercial shipping and endangering innocent crew members should be avoided entirely. That earlier statement noted, with real concern, that precious lives, including of Indian citizens, had already been lost in previous attacks during this conflict, and that the intensity and lethality of these attacks only seemed to be increasing over time. So India had been raising its voice about exactly this kind of danger for weeks before its own ships were the ones actually targeted directly. That context matters, because it tells you the April 18th incident wasn't some sudden, unprecedented shock coming out of nowhere. It was the exact scenario India had been publicly warning about finally landing on its own doorstep. I want to pause here and give you some context about why this specific diplomatic move actually matters so much, because I don't think most people outside India fully understand just how unusual this response really is. And I think that context is exactly what separates a genuinely informative breakdown from just reporting a single headline. India's entire post-independence foreign policy has been built around a doctrine called non-alignment. For decades, that's meant staying deliberately, carefully neutral in exactly this kind of great power and regional conflict. Refusing to pick sides, refusing to join military coalitions, refusing to let disputes with any single country spiral into open confrontation. This isn't some fringe policy position either. It's been the guiding philosophy behind Indian foreign policy since the earliest years after independence, shaping everything from India's approach to the Cold War to its careful balancing act between the United States, Russia, and China in the present day. That's not ancient history either. It's active policy, playing out in real time throughout this entire war, and it's exactly why India's response to the April 18th attack deserves this much attention rather than being treated as a routine diplomatic footnote. According to Bloomberg's reporting from earlier this year, India's Ministry of External Affairs explicitly confirmed that discussions about the Strait of Hormuz crisis hadn't even been raised with the United States, quote, in a bilateral setting. India's spokesman, Randhir Jaiswal, made clear the country's long-standing policy is to participate in international military operations only under a United Nations mandate, not by aligning with any single powers coalition, a formal publicly stated position, rather than just an informal preference, only under a UN mandate, not siding with anyone, not even close allies. When it comes to actual military coordination, a standard India has held consistently across decades of shifting global alliances and conflicts. President Trump directly asked countries around the world to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. According to that same Bloomberg reporting, India simply didn't respond to that request at all, neither confirming nor denying involvement. A classic non-aligned diplomatic posture, if there ever was one, letting silence itself do the diplomatic work rather than issuing any kind of formal refusal. Gulf News' reporting from around this same period reinforced exactly the same pattern. A senior Indian official told that outlet directly that direct talks with Iran had proven the most effective way to actually restart shipping through the strait, even as calls grew louder for a broader multinational naval effort to secure the waterway by force. That's India explicitly choosing quiet diplomacy over military coalition building, even while other countries, France, Italy, Greece, were actively expanding their own naval protection missions in the wider Gulf region during that exact same window. And yet, at the exact same time India was publicly staying silent on Trump's coalition request, something else was quietly happening that tells a completely different story, and I think this is genuinely the most fascinating part of this entire situation. According to a detailed report from the Maritime Executive, India had already launched something called Operation Urja Suraksha, meaning energy protection, deploying more than 5 Indian warships to guide and protect its own commercial vessels through the exact same war zone. 5 warships, operating inside an active conflict, entirely independent of the American-led coalition, entirely on India's own terms, answering to nobody's command structure but its own. That same reporting described the operation's approach specifically. It was being conducted with, quote, the highest degree of caution and minimal publicity, a deliberate strategy to protect Indian shipping without making any kind of loud, provocative statement to either side of this war, a genuinely careful balancing act between actually protecting its interests and avoiding the appearance of taking sides. Quiet. Deliberate. But genuinely unprecedented for a country that spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of direct military posture near an active war zone, especially one involving a major regional power. It maintains as delicate a relationship with as it does with Iran. The Maritime Executive's reporting noted something else worth sitting with too. None of the Indian warships actually entered the Strait of Hormuz itself. They remained positioned above the Gulf of Oman, near its terminus, staying in constant communication with merchant vessels, and guiding them once they'd already cleared the strait on their own, a carefully calibrated line between presence and provocation. So even at its most assertive, India drew a careful line, present, protective, but not actually inside the most contested waters themselves, a distinction that itself tells you a lot about how deliberately calculated this entire posture actually was. According to Wyon's reporting, that operation eventually grew into 2 dedicated warship task forces, providing what was described as an active security corridor for tankers and merchant vessels, specifically as they exited the strait, a genuinely substantial and sustained commitment of naval resources. 2 full task forces, not a token gesture. A genuine, sustained naval commitment requiring real logistics, real coordination, and real risk to Indian personnel operating that close to an active conflict. The week's coverage added more specific numbers. 3 Indian warships were confirmed in the Gulf of Oman at one point, with reports indicating that number would grow to 6 or 7 as the crisis continued, keeping constant watch over fuel carriers headed to Indian ports, a scale of deployment that had steadily grown as the underlying crisis itself kept intensifying. 6 or 7 warships. In a region India has traditionally approached with extreme caution, specifically to avoid exactly this kind of entanglement. A number that tells you this was never meant to be a brief, symbolic gesture, but a genuinely sustained operational commitment for as long as the crisis demanded it. I want to give you my honest read on why this specific combination, quiet naval deployment plus a genuinely sharp diplomatic protest after the April 18th attack, actually represents India crossing a line that very few people expected. And I think it's more significant than any single headline about a strike or a summoned ambassador on their own. India has maintained a genuinely delicate balancing act with Iran throughout this entire war. And I think it's worth showing you exactly how delicate, because it makes everything that came after even more remarkable. Back in early March, according to Reuters' reporting, India allowed an Iranian warship, the Iris Lavin, to dock at the port of Kochi as what Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar called a humanitarian gesture on the exact same day a U.S. submarine sank a sister Iranian vessel off the coast of Sri Lanka. Let that sink in. The same day America sank one Iranian warship, India was quietly sheltering another one, purely on humanitarian grounds, according to its own foreign minister. A genuinely striking juxtaposition given that both vessels had been in India's own waters just days earlier for the exact same naval exercise. That earlier context matters enormously too. Both the Lavan and the Dina, the vessel that was ultimately sunk, had been in India for the International Fleet Review, an event New Delhi itself had hosted, before departing for home and getting caught up directly in this war. Reuters reported that India received the request to dock the Lavan on February 28th, the very day the war started, with an Indian government source describing the request as urgent because the vessel had developed technical issues. Jaishankar's own words about that decision were direct. Quote, "I think we really approached it from the point of view of humanity. Of other than whatever the legal issues were, I think we did the right thing. That's the India that exists on one side of this war, careful, humanitarian, deliberately avoiding taking sides even when doing so meant sheltering a vessel from a country actively fighting American and Israeli forces, at real potential diplomatic cost to its relationship with Washington. And that's exactly what makes the response to the April 18th attack so genuinely significant. This wasn't a country itching for confrontation with Iran. This was a country that had bent over backward to stay neutral, even offering safe harbor to an Iranian warship crew just weeks earlier, only to have its own civilian tankers shot at anyway, 24 hours after Iran's own foreign minister had personally promised safe passage. If any country had earned the benefit of the doubt from Iran through genuine, demonstrated goodwill, it was India, and that goodwill still wasn't enough to keep its ships safe when it actually mattered. Before I keep going, I want to ask you directly for something, because putting a story like this together properly, cross-referencing Marine Insight, Naval Today, Iran International, the Middle East Forum, Bloomberg, the Maritime Executive, and Reuters, all reporting on a country that almost never gets this kind of coverage in Western media, takes real time and real care. If that kind of properly sourced breakdown is what brings you to this channel, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because I think stories like this one, about how smaller and mid-sized powers are actually navigating this war, deserve just as much attention as the US-Iran headlines we usually cover. I'd also point out, if you've been following our other coverage of this war, the Strait of Hormuz operations, the Mosquito Fleet engagement, the F-35 incidents, the Karg Island pressure campaign, every one of those stories has an India-shaped shadow sitting underneath it that almost never gets mentioned. Every strike on the strait, every naval blockade, every diplomatic collapse ripples out and directly affects countries like India that depend enormously on that exact waterway for their own energy security, even though they never asked to be part of this fight in the first place. I think that's genuinely one of the most underappreciated dimensions of covering a war like this one. It's easy to treat a conflict as a two-sided story, America and Iran, strikes and retaliation, when the reality is that dozens of countries around the world are quietly making their own difficult calculations about how to protect their own citizens and their own economies, without ever making it into the main headlines most people actually see. I think India's story here is a genuinely good example of exactly that dynamic playing out in real time, and I'd like to bring you more of these kinds of stories going forward if there's real interest in seeing them. Let me give you my honest strategic read on what this entire episode actually reveals about India's position in this war, because I think it's genuinely more complicated and more interesting than a simple story about an attack and a protest. And I think it says something important about how mid-sized powers navigate conflicts they never asked to be part of. India isn't choosing a side in the traditional sense. It hasn't joined the American-led coalition. It hasn't condemned Iran as an enemy state. It hasn't deployed warships to strike anyone. What India has actually done is something quieter and, in some ways, more sophisticated, building an entirely independent capability to protect its own interests, its own ships, its own energy supply, its own citizens, without formally aligning with either combatant, threading a needle that most countries caught up in this war haven't even attempted. That's a genuinely difficult diplomatic tightrope to walk, and I think the April 18th attack is exactly the kind of event that tests whether that tightrope actually holds under real pressure. India didn't retaliate militarily, it didn't send warships into the strait itself to confront the gunboats responsible, but it also didn't stay silent. Summoning an ambassador is a real formal diplomatic escalation, not a symbolic gesture, and it came from a government that had spent the previous weeks bending over backward to avoid exactly that kind of confrontation, even sheltering an Iranian warship crew on humanitarian grounds just weeks earlier. I think that's the honest, complete picture of the line India actually crossed here. Not a military line. India never fired a shot at Iran throughout any of this, and I want to be completely clear about that, so nobody walks away from this video thinking otherwise, but a diplomatic and strategic one, moving from quiet, careful neutrality toward a much more assertive posture, willing to publicly rebuke Iran directly while still refusing to formally join anyone's coalition. That's a genuinely narrow, difficult position to hold, and I think April 18th is the day it became clear India was actually willing to hold it under real pressure, rather than folding into either full-blown confrontation or complete diplomatic silence. There's also a broader lesson here about how this entire war has forced countries that have absolutely nothing to do with the original U.S. Israel-Iran dispute to make genuinely difficult choices about their own security and their own economic interests. India depends heavily on energy imports moving through exactly this waterway, and no amount of careful non-alignment doctrine changes the basic reality that its own citizens' safety and its own economy's stability were directly on the line the moment those gunboats opened fire. That's the kind of pressure that eventually forces even the most determinedly neutral countries to make real consequential decisions. And I think watching exactly how India threaded that needle is genuinely instructive for understanding how this entire war has rippled out far beyond its original combatants. I think it's also worth comparing India's approach directly against how other countries handled this exact same pressure, because the contrast genuinely sharpens just how distinctive India's path actually was. Ships from France, Italy, and Greece were already providing protection for commercial vessels against Houthi-linked attacks in the broader Gulf region during the same period, with officials indicating that mission could potentially expand further. A French diplomat confirmed Paris was actively coordinating with partners on a joint naval effort specifically aimed at securing the strait itself, a formal multinational coalition-style approach. That's the European model: joint naval efforts, coordinated multinational missions, explicit alignment with a broader Western security effort. India deliberately chose a completely different path, building its own entirely separate, entirely independent capability instead, answering to nobody's combined command structure and coordinating with no formal coalition partner whatsoever. I think that distinction is genuinely the whole story here in miniature. Where European navies leaned into collective security arrangements built on decades of alliance structures, India built something bespoke, sized specifically to its own needs, deployed entirely on its own terms, and withdrawn from formal politics whenever possible, even while the underlying military commitment remained completely real and substantial. That's not a minor stylistic difference either. It reflects two genuinely different theories about how a country should protect its interests during a war it isn't formally part of, one built on collective alliance structures, and one built on strategic self-reliance and careful, deliberate distance from any formal coalition. Watching both approaches play out simultaneously in the exact same waterway, over the exact same underlying threat, is honestly one of the more interesting comparative case studies to come out of this entire war, even though it rarely gets the same attention as the headline strikes between the US and Iran themselves. Given everything we just walked through, do you think India's approach here independent naval protection plus sharp diplomatic pushback without ever formally choosing a side is actually the smartest way for a country like India to navigate a war this volatile? Or do you think staying this determinedly neutral eventually becomes impossible to sustain the longer this conflict drags on? There's a genuinely interesting historical parallel worth thinking through here too. Other non-aligned nations have faced similar tests throughout history when conflicts they wanted no part of ended up threatening their own citizens directly. And the outcomes of those tests have varied enormously depending on how much real leverage the neutral country actually had to work with. Drop your honest answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And I think this is exactly the kind of story where perspectives from outside the usual US or Iran framing add something genuinely valuable to the conversation. If you've got any personal or family connection to India's maritime industry, its seafaring community, or its foreign policy establishment specifically, I'd especially love to hear your take, because I think first-hand perspective on exactly how this balancing act actually feels from the inside would add something no amount of outside reporting can fully capture. India has one of the largest populations of seafarers anywhere in the world, and I suspect a lot of families connected to that industry have been watching this exact crisis far more closely than most Western coverage of this war has ever acknowledged. Thank you so much for watching, for sticking with a story that took us outside the usual Iran headlines for once. Stories like this one, about how the rest of the world is actually absorbing and responding to this war, are exactly why I don't think this channel should only ever cover the two main combatants. Because the reality is, dozens of countries are being pulled into this conflict's orbit in ways that rarely make it into mainstream coverage. I think there's real value in occasionally stepping back from the main battlefield to show you exactly how much wider this war's actual footprint has become. And I'd like to keep doing that whenever a story like this one crosses my desk. So here's my bottom line on this entire story. India never fired a shot at Iran. It never joined an American-led coalition. It never publicly condemned Tehran as an enemy state. Judged purely by the loudest, most dramatic markers of a country entering a war, India stayed completely on the sidelines throughout this entire conflict, exactly as its non-alignment doctrine would predict. But judged by what actually happened on the water and in the halls of diplomacy, a very different picture emerges. 6 or 7 warships deployed near an active conflict zone, 2 dedicated task forces built specifically for this crisis, an ambassador summoned in one of the sharpest protests of the entire war. None of that fits neatly into the traditional story of a neutral country staying above the fray, and I think that gap between the quiet, careful public messaging and the substantial, sustained action underneath it is exactly what makes this story worth telling in this much detail. That's the line I think genuinely got crossed here. Not a line between peace and war, but a line between passive neutrality and something far more active. A country quietly building real, independent capability to protect its own interests, while still publicly maintaining the language and posture of strict non-alignment. Whether that specific model holds up if this war keeps dragging on, or whether India eventually faces a moment where that careful balancing act becomes genuinely impossible to sustain, is honestly one of the more interesting open questions sitting inside this entire broader conflict, and I don't think anyone, including officials inside India's own government, can tell you with full confidence how that eventually resolves. There's a human dimension to this story too that I think deserves real attention, because it's easy to lose sight of when we're talking about warships and diplomatic protests in the abstract. India has one of the largest populations of professional seafarers anywhere on the planet, and throughout this entire war, government control rooms have been fielding thousands of calls and emails from families desperate for information about loved ones caught in exactly this kind of conflict zone. Every single one of those Indian-flagged tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz has real crew members aboard, often dozens of Indian citizens on a single vessel, each one somebody's father, son, husband, or brother, working an already dangerous job that suddenly became exponentially more dangerous the moment this war began. That's part of why the April 18th incident carries the weight it does, beyond just the geopolitics. Those weren't abstract vessels caught in an abstract dispute over shipping lanes. They were real ships carrying real Indian citizens, people whose families back home would have spent that day in genuine fear once news of the attacks started circulating, waiting for confirmation that their relatives were actually safe. I think that's worth remembering anytime we talk about naval deployments and diplomatic summons in a story like this one. The strategic chess match between India's non-alignment doctrine and its genuine need to protect its own citizens isn't just an academic exercise in foreign policy analysis. It's playing out with real consequences for real families every single time. A ship like this one gets caught in the crossfire of a war it has absolutely nothing to do with. I also think it's worth acknowledging just how much uncertainty everyday seafarers have had to live with throughout this entire conflict, never quite knowing whether the specific stretch of water they're about to sail through has been genuinely secured, or whether the assurances given by any government involved, including Iran's own repeated promises about safe passage, will actually hold up once their ship is the one testing them. That's an extraordinary amount of pressure to carry into what's normally just a routine, if demanding, job, and I don't think it gets nearly enough acknowledgement in most coverage of this war. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off, and I will see you in the next one.